Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight begins our peaceful journey through the lives of England's most remarkable queens, a collection of extraordinary women who shaped the crown and kingdom from the 12th century through the Tudor era. In part 1, we'll softly explore the medieval powerhouses of Empress Matilda and Isabella of France, from Matilda's fierce battle for her rightful throne during the Anarchy, to Isabella's dramatic transformation from young bride to the she-wolf of France, all while witnessing how these remarkable women navigated the treacherous waters of medieval politics. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video. Leave a gentle comment about which of these medieval queens fascinates you most, and subscribe to keep these soothing tales coming your way. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from medieval England lull you into restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Matilda, later known as Empress Matilda, entered this world most likely on February 7th, 1102 at Sutton Courtenay in Berkshire, nestled in the gentle countryside of southern England. Her father stood as King Henry III of England, the youngest among the sons of William the Conqueror, that Norman Duke who had crossed the English Channel in 1066 to begin England's conquest from the Anglo-Saxons and Danes. Henry had claimed his throne following his brother's death, King William II, also called William Rufus, 2 years before Matilda's arrival. The previous monarch had perished in what seemed a hunting mishap. Though whispers of suspicion lingered in court circles, Matilda received her name from her mother, Matilda of Scotland, daughter to King Malcolm III of Scotland, and his wife Margaret of Wessex, an Anglo-Saxon royal princess. Through this remarkable lineage, young Matilda carried the blood of Norman kings, Norman dukes, Scottish royalty, and the ancient Anglo-Saxon rulers who had governed England before the Norman conquest. She shared her childhood with just one sibling, a brother named William Adelin, born 18 months after her arrival. As the male heir, William naturally became successor to the throne at birth, yet should misfortune befall him, Matilda would inherit Henry's crown. Though this prospect troubled many who believed rulers must above all serve as military commanders. Henry had fathered over 20 children through various mistresses, but these remained illegitimate and could never succeed him. Matilda's birth occurred within a political landscape far more intricate than today's world. The fragmented nature of Western Europe would influence her entire existence. Her father governed England, already a reasonably unified kingdom with growing authority over Welsh lords westward, and, temporarily at least, peaceful relations with Scotland due to Henry's marriage to Matilda's Scottish mother. Across the English Channel, complexity multiplied dramatically. Henry and his extended family ruled the Duchy of Normandy northward, while maintaining influence over territories like the County of Blois through marriage alliances. A French king ruled from Paris, though his control barely resembled today's French nation-state, with lords such as the Norman dukes and Anjou lords nominally serving as his vassals, owing feudal homage. Eastward, Germany remained similarly divided into countless duchies, counties, and principalities, yet maintained centralized authority through the Holy Roman Emperors. When Matilda arrived, Emperor Henry IV held this position, though from 1098 onward, he shared rule with his son, future Emperor Henry V. Though distant during her upbringing, German events would soon impact young Matilda's life. Several important medieval chronicles survive from 12th century England and Normandy, providing our principal sources for Matilda's life and reign. German chronicles from this period also reference Matilda due to her marriage to the Holy Roman Emperor between 1114 and 1125. Many English chroniclers, including William of Malmesbury and Henry of Huntingdon, lived during Matilda's time and wrote extensively about her life and royal claims. While some present favourable accounts, most paint negative portraits, particularly the Gesta Stephani, the Acts of Stephen, which unsurprisingly favoured Matilda's cousin Stephen's claim to the English throne. Unfortunately, a biographical history of Matilda, written by French bishop and chronicler Arnulf of Lisieux, disappeared during the late medieval period, a text that would have provided additional insight into her character and reigns across Germany, France, and England. Numerous Tudor historians in the 16th century also examined Matilda's claims to the English throne during a period when Queen Mary the Fair and Queen Elizabeth I's rapid succession in 1553 and 1558 prompted Englishmen to reconsider the history and nature of female monarchy. These chronicles offer incomplete accounts of Matilda's early years. She grew up within an itinerant court that frequently travelled between England and northern France, with her parents residing periodically at Westminster near London or at Rouen in Normandy. This extensive court comprised lords from England and France, where French served as the common language. Though she had only one full brother, Matilda matured among nearly 24 illegitimate half-siblings and numerous first cousins, including children of her father's sister, Adela, Countess of Blois. She possibly received education from Anselm, Archbishop of Canterbury, and one of Christendom's most learned men before his death in 1109. Other monks and bishops would have tutored the royal court's children during a period when European educational standards experienced major growth, leading modern historians to speak of a 12th century Renaissance that preceded Italy's 15th century Renaissance. Matilda's formal education ended abruptly due to her position as a political asset in European politics. As her father's only legitimate daughter, Matilda's marriage prospects held immense importance. As early as 1109, diplomatic negotiations developed between her father and Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor and Central Europe's most powerful figure, regarding a potential marriage between the emperor and Matilda. Despite their roughly 20-year age difference, such overtures from such a prominent figure demanded consideration, and in 1110, when Matilda reached just 8 years old, she travelled to Germany as part of a diplomatic mission, where accompanying diplomats finalized negotiations with the emperor. Despite her absurdly young age, her father agreed to his daughter's betrothal to the emperor, and thereafter she lived for 4 years in Western Germany to acclimate herself to German culture and language of the people she would eventually rule as empress. Even by medieval European standards, holding a wedding ceremony in January 1114 at Worms, when Matilda remained weeks short of her 12th birthday, while Henry V had reached his late 20s or perhaps 33 years, was unusual. Typically, marriage ceremonies waited until participants reached at least 13 or 14 and entered their young adult years by contemporary standards. Matilda spent over a decade as Holy Roman Empress, the most senior royal woman in Germany. This proved a turbulent period in imperial history, as her husband essentially warred with the papacy in Rome for control over northern Italy, a major Holy Roman Empire component at this time. Henry V had even faced excommunication with papal sanction in 1112, 2 years before marrying Matilda. During the early post-marriage years, Henry spent considerable time campaigning south into the Lombardy plain, and eventually Matilda joined him there with her entourage and household staff. At one point in 1117, even heading toward Rome itself, as the emperor attempted to seize the Eternal City. Curiously, despite her youth, Matilda played an active political role by 1116 and 1117, with evidence suggesting she attended government councils and served as an unofficial sponsor of political measures reaching the imperial court. In 1117, she also claimed the Holy Roman Empress title as Henry emerged victorious from Italian military clashes. However, Pope Paschal II withheld his approval of this title, and whether she legally qualified as Empress or simply held the junior, imperial title of Queen of the Romans remained debated for years. Matilda consistently maintained her Empress Matilda designation, even long after departing Germany. In 1118, Matilda's governmental significance became clear when Henry returned to Germany to suppress growing unrest among several feudal lords there, leaving Matilda in charge of imperial government south of the Alps during his absence. She played crucial roles in subsequent years, notably in resolving the investitures controversy, a long-running dispute between successive Holy Roman emperors and popes since 1076, regarding whether emperors could appoint archbishops and bishops in Holy Roman Empire lands or whether the Pope held final authority in investing these ecclesiastical offices. This controversy finally found resolution through the Concordat of Worms, agreed upon in 1122 in the German city bearing its name. Matilda played an unofficial diplomatic role in reaching a major compromise that gave emperors and popes different roles in investing bishops throughout the empire. Matilda's life trajectory changed dramatically due to events on November 25, 1120. That evening, her brother and English throne heir, William Adelin, departed with a large contingent of nobles and courtiers to sail from Barfleur in Normandy across the Channel to England. Besides William Adelin, several of the king's illegitimate children boarded the vessel, though Henry himself was not present, having already arranged his own passage back to England. The party apparently consumed considerable alcohol before boarding the vessel called the White Ship, captained by Thomas Fitzstephen. The ship never reached its destination. Shortly after leaving Barfleur harbour, the vessel struck a submerged rock protruding from the seafloor and quickly began sinking. Of approximately 300 passengers, only one reportedly survived. Among the dead was William Adelin, and with her brother's death, the succession fell into complete disarray, as the king's only legitimate male heir had perished. Matilda subsequently became central to succession debates. The White Ship incident would eventually lead to civil war and the anarchy in England and Normandy, as Matilda's rightful place in the succession line faced challenges. Following the White Ship disaster, political turmoil erupted in England and northern France. Henry had lost his only legitimate son and obvious heir to his dominions. Now only Matilda remained among his children as a legitimate child born in wedlock and thus a potential successor. Many might have expected Henry to seek a new heir outside his immediate family. Two potential candidates were his nephews, sons of his sister Adela, Theobald, Count of Blois, and his younger brother Stephen. The latter might have seemed an especially likely heir. Henry had shown immense favour towards Stephen throughout the 1110s as he entered adulthood, bestowing extensive lands and feudal honours upon him in England and making him the foremost figure in the Alençon region along Normandy's southern borders. Retrospectively, Henry appeared to have been grooming Stephen as a potential backup heir during these years should anything happen to William Adelin. Yet when the moment arrived to potentially do so after the White Ship, Henry made clear that Matilda was now his designated successor. Despite her father's efforts to secure her position as his heir, Matilda gained acceptance from only a minority of those who mattered: the knights and lords of England and northern France, and the senior ecclesiastical figures of the English Church. When Henry died and a successor required crowning, whether Matilda became queen would depend on these men's willingness to honour the king's wishes. Many hesitated. While England would eventually accept female leaders in coming centuries, the issue of a female monarch seemed problematic when a ruler's primary duty involved leading feudal lords into battle. This situation also existed in France, where traditional law dictated that the position of queen regnant was forbidden, allowing only a queen consort to a king regnant. Aware of these issues, Henry regularly called his lords together throughout the 1120s and early 1130s to have them swear formal oaths upholding his succession plans. As backup, he also married for a second time to Adeliza of Louvain in 1121. This marriage, however, proved even less successful than his first at producing legitimate children. No children resulted from it, and Matilda remained Henry's sole legally viable heir. Another problem Matilda's potential succession presented was her status as an absentee heir. In 1114, she had married Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV. While this represented a politically important marriage to one of Europe's most powerful figures at that time, it also meant she lived in Germany and other Central European parts during the early 1120s, even as Henry tried convincing his lords to accept her as his heir. In an age before mass media such as printing, maintaining a physical presence in one's dominions proved extremely important. This explained why kings and queens regularly journeyed around their kingdoms to be seen in person and reassert their authority to their subjects. Matilda's absence in Germany proved doubly difficult because of this. After all, England's lords truly had no idea who they were being asked to swear oaths to in the early 1120s. Perhaps Matilda was a strong, poised woman who could make a good ruler someday. Alternatively, perhaps she was the direct opposite, a weak-willed, insignificant person who could not be respected as a potential heir. The point was that nobody could be certain, making Henry's task all the more difficult. Eventually, The English king's son-in-law, Emperor Henry V, resolved this problem by dying prematurely in May 1125 of some form of cancer while campaigning in the Low Countries. He and Matilda had no surviving children, though a child had been born years earlier but died in infancy. The imperial title thus passed to Lothair of Supplinburg, Duke of Saxony. Freed from her marriage bonds and with no children or family tying her to Germany, Matilda returned home to England in 1126. There, her father's knights and lords would have their first sustained impression of the woman Henry wanted to rule over them someday. They should have been somewhat reassured. Matilda was a poised, capable woman, one who might not have been able to lead them into battle traditionally, but whom many would have believed could make a good queen. Still, others could never be convinced of female monarchy's plausibility, and others were more broadly disillusioned with the high taxation levels the king imposed, deepening their opposition to his succession plans. After time in England, Matilda crossed the English Channel and took residence in Normandy. Here she continued styling herself as Empress Matilda despite her husband the Emperor's death in 1125, an affectation that subsequent chroniclers and historians happily continued. Matilda remains known to history as Empress Matilda to this day. In France, her father soon arranged another marriage for her. This time, the proposed groom was Geoffrey Plantagenet, son and heir of the Count of Anjou, Touraine, and Maine. The counties of Anjou, Touraine, and Maine were sizable feudal lordships lying south of Normandy, north of the county of Poitou, and west of Paris. They covered a substantial proportion of north-central France, making Matilda's marriage to Geoffrey, at least superficially, an astute move, ensuring Matilda would have financial and military backing if she had to fight for her crown after Henry died. Yet the marriage proved problematic in other ways. Geoffrey remained 10 weeks shy of his 15th birthday when they married on June 17, 1128, and once he succeeded as Count of Anjou, Touraine, and Maine the following year, he soon developed a reputation for heavy-handedness that aroused animosity among some minor Normandy lords northward. This alienated some further potential Matilda supporters, though ultimately, the resources Anjou could bring to bear after Henry's death proved crucial in keeping Matilda's hopes of claiming the throne alive. The late 1120s and early 1130s proved difficult years for Matilda. Much of this arose from ongoing succession issues. By this time, Matilda's first cousin Stephen of Blois was emerging as a clear rival. Around 1125, approximately when Matilda's first husband died and she began preparing to return to England, Stephen had married Matilda of Boulogne, who had just succeeded as Countess of Boulogne. This made Stephen lord of one of northern France's foremost polities, one lying directly on the English Channel coast, as well as further lands in Kent in southeastern England, further strengthening his position. Meanwhile, Matilda's marriage troubled her, and within a year of it, Matilda decided to leave Anjou and went to live in Normandy. A reconciliation was reached in 1131. However, the entire situation had irked Matilda's father, who believed she was letting personal feelings interfere with the need to find a lasting political solution to the succession crisis. Henry's final years witnessed a steady decline in the relationship between king and daughter. Though he never indicated any shift in his thinking on the succession, Henry's steadfastness in his determination to have Matilda succeed him was perhaps the result of 1133's events. That spring, Matilda gave birth to her first child, a relief after a long and largely childless marriage to Emperor Henry V, and several years of marriage to Geoffrey, without an heir there either. Born on March 5, 1133 at Le Mans, the boy was named Henry by his parents after his grandfather the king, a pointed statement to Matilda's father and the political realm at large that Matilda now had an heir of her own. If she did become queen in succession to her father, it would be an interim reign preparing for the eventual accession of another King Henry someday. The king was elated, and the birth led him to cross to Normandy to see his grandchild. A reconciliation seemed to have been effected between him and Matilda. It was short-lived though. A year later, Matilda gave birth to another son, this one named Geoffrey. The birth was difficult, and it seemed that Matilda would die at one point, leading to a new dispute with her father about the terms of Matilda's own will and her proposed burial place. Thus, the rapprochement between father and daughter did not last long. Matilda's father died on December 1st, 1135, while in Normandy. Even though he was around 67 years of age at the time, he had been campaigning in northern France against a rebellion of some Normandy lords at the time of his death, though the king had never flinched from supporting Matilda as his successor. His daughter and son-in-law were offering some support to the rebel lords at the time of Henry's death. The king's death was rumoured to be due to eating too many lampreys, a kind of fish. Perhaps some form of food poisoning was involved, although his death at such an advanced age could also have just as easily been from natural causes. As the news spread, it became evident that Henry's lords and knights did not all intend to support Matilda's claim to succeed him. Instead, many began scheming immediately. Stephen of Blois, Matilda's first cousin, quickly seized the initiative. Within a week of the king's death, he was in England gathering support from senior church figures and nobles. Then he gained the acclamation of London's people and finally was crowned as King Stephen I at Westminster Abbey on December 22nd, 1135, just 3 weeks after Henry's death. Stephen had managed to secure the crown in breach of Henry I's wishes, largely because of propitious timing and positioning. When news of the old king's death began to spread, Stephen was not far away from Normandy and Boulogne and was best placed to cross quickly to England. The same could not be said of his brother Theobald of Blois, another potential candidate for the throne. Similarly, Matilda was further south in Anjou and barely had time to react before news arrived that Stephen had been crowned at Westminster in England. Another reason why Matilda was able to do little to prevent Stephen from seizing the crown was that she was pregnant again when her father died, and in mid-1536 would give birth to her third and final son, William. Each of her sons, Henry, Geoffrey, and William, would be known to contemporaries and for centuries to come by the names Henry Fitz-Empress, Geoffrey Fitz-Empress, and William Fitz-Empress. Fitz, meaning son of, and Empress, referring to Matilda's decision to continue using this title long after her first husband's death. Matilda and Geoffrey did not immediately commence war with Stephen to try to reclaim the throne for Matilda. They simply were not in a strong enough position to do so. Instead, they would wait a few years, slowly gathering allies and preparing militarily and financially for the coming war. What tipped their hand and led to the outbreak of the civil war known as the Anarchy was when numerous powerful English lords signalled their support for Matilda's cause and opposition to Stephen in 1137 and 1138. The most prominent was Robert of Gloucester, an illegitimate half-brother of Matilda's, whom Henry I had promoted to become an earl and to hold extensive lands in England. From Stephen's first arrival in England in December 1135, Robert had indicated his reluctance to accept his cousin as the new monarch, attempting to block his coronation. He was joined in now throwing his backing behind Matilda by Ranulph of Chester, another powerful English earl with considerable land and support in the northwest of the country. Matilda also gained support for a time from King David of Scotland, who hoped to gain further lands along the border through his involvement in the Civil War. The anarchy began when Robert of Gloucester rebelled in 1138. The following year, Matilda arrived in England at the head of an army from France. Over the next few years, the conflict would develop with Matilda, Geoffrey, Gloucester, and their other allies holding much of the West Midlands and West Country for Matilda's cause and establishing the port city of Bristol as their base of operations. While Stephen retained control over London, the surrounding home counties, and East Anglia, most of the fighting in the anarchy would play out in the Midlands and regions like Oxfordshire, which lay between Bristol and London. In the war that followed, Matilda most certainly lost the public relations campaign, while German chroniclers, who wrote about her time as the wife of Emperor Henry V between 1114 and 1125, were generally favourable toward her, as were many French writers. In general, Matilda was perceived poorly by English chroniclers and historians. They viewed her as a foreign upstart who was married to the much reviled Count of Anjou. Why this was the case is not entirely clear. Stephen, who was portrayed much more sympathetically by chroniclers like William of Malmesbury and Henry of Huntingdon, was hardly an Englishman himself, having been born in France, hailing from Blois, and being Count of Boulogne in northern France prior to seizing the throne of England. Conversely, he had spent periods of time in England since the mid-1110s and had extensive estates there, whereas Matilda, though born in England, had always been a distant figure in Germany, Italy, and France. Stephen also appears to have been more humble, whereas English commentators were at pains to stress Matilda's proud and often overbearing nature, something which led one writer to refer to her, even in her later years, as being of a tyrannical disposition. All of this was evidenced in her insistence on being termed Empress Matilda. Unquestionably, the most consequential events of the Anarchy, other than those that brought it to an end many years later, occurred in 1141. Early that year, Stephen was laying siege to Lincoln Castle when Robert of Gloucester marched with several hundred knights and a large contingent of Welsh allies to relieve the siege. The Battle of Lincoln ensued on February the 2nd, 1141, after Gloucester and his forces arrived. It was a decisive defeat for Stephen, one in which he was abandoned by many of his allies under pressure from Gloucester's forces. Stephen and his own entourage became surrounded in the midst of the melee, and despite their efforts to fight their way out, Stephen was captured by Gloucester's forces. Now a prisoner, he was taken west towards Bristol, where Matilda ordered his imprisonment in Bristol Castle. This incredible victory left Matilda seemingly victorious, though Stephen's cause was not defeated. No sooner did word arrive in London and Westminster of the king's capture than his wife, confusingly also named Matilda, began gathering forces to strike back against the Empress and to keep Stephen's cause alive. The brief war of the two Matildas, which would follow, would soon lead to another major shift in the military and political landscape. All of that lay in the months ahead. In the immediate term, Matilda had won a major victory over Stephen and had her great adversary in captivity. She now moved to claim her birthright and fulfill her father's wishes for the succession by becoming ruler of England. And yet, there was a peculiar aspect to this. Although Matilda generally used the title of Empress and was now aspiring to become queen, she did not adopt either of these titles, instead issuing royal charters and grants under the title of Domina Anglorum, meaning Lady of the English. In early April, she and her followers, along with some leading figures of the English church that she had won over to her cause, arrived in Winchester, home of one of the greatest Gothic cathedrals in Europe and a very important centre of the medieval English church. There, Matilda was made queen in a makeshift ceremony. However, a subsequent campaign to try and seize London failed, and Matilda gained neither the acclamation of the people of the capital, nor was she crowned at Westminster. This was despite winning over Geoffrey de Mandeville, who controlled the Tower of London at the time. Yet, when Matilda advanced to try and enter London, the inhabitants indicated their clear unwillingness to allow her entry. Somewhat surprisingly, she did have the agreement of Stephen himself, who told some of his supporters to agree to the coronation of Matilda, perhaps fearing that he would be murdered at Bristol if he did not. Nevertheless, many people continued to view Matilda's coronation as entirely illegitimate. Matilda did not have long to enjoy her success. The other Matilda, Stephen's wife, Matilda of Boulogne, had gathered sufficient forces by this time that she was able to begin campaigning into the Midlands with the aid of her brother-in-law, Henry, Bishop of Winchester, and William of Ypres, a lord of the Low Countries, who had brought mercenary troops to England to aid Stephen. On September 14th, they descended on Winchester and thoroughly routed the forces which were gathered there in support of Matilda. The rout of Winchester was significant in that Robert of Gloucester was also captured during the fighting. With her foremost ally and half-brother now in the hands of Stephen's wife and his allies, Matilda had no option but to arrange for the release of Stephen from Bristol. Hence, not much more than half a year after defeating Stephen at Lincoln, capturing him, and having herself proclaimed as Lady of the English, Matilda was forced to release her cousin, and the Civil War was back to being as contentious an affair as it had ever been. Because Matilda did not renounce the titles she had adopted in April 1141, it is usually held by historians of the period that there were, in effect, two monarchs of England that had been crowned in different ways: King Stephen and Queen Matilda. This situation would continue throughout the 1140s. This was a period of a truly peculiar number of instances in which the leaders of the Civil War were captured, imprisoned, escaped, or narrowly avoided being detained. Matilda herself had two close calls. The first came in 1141, when she was at Devizes Castle in Wiltshire. It had been built a half-century or so earlier by the Bishop of Salisbury and became one of the foremost strongholds in southwestern England by the end of Henry I's reign. Matilda was here in 1141 when some of Stephen's forces arrived there. They appeared to have been unaware that Matilda was at Devizes. Nevertheless, any effort by her to try and escape would have resulted in her being detected. Consequently, she decided to sneak out by dressing in burial clothes and then being tied down onto a funeral bier. Her attendants then carried her out of Devizes as though they were removing a corpse. Apparently, Matilda stayed in her prostrate and bound position for many hours until the company had made their way entirely out of the region in which Stephen's forces were marauding and to the safety of Gloucester. Later, her forces recaptured Devizes, and she would reward the inhabitants for their help in aiding her escape, granting them a royal charter to hold markets as a small borough town. A second close call occurred in 1142. After the rout of Winchester and the release of Stephen and Robert of Gloucester, the fighting in 1142 began to centre on Oxford. Stephen became aware that Matilda had moved her government here by that time and came to the conclusion that if he could capture her, it would strike a definitive blow and end the war. Thus, in the autumn, he advanced on Oxford, the site of an impressive castle and a town which had already emerged as a centre of higher education. Caught unaware by the advance of Stephen's forces, Matilda and her followers were trapped inside Oxford Castle as a siege began from September 1142 onwards. By the winter, over 2.5 months into the siege, conditions inside were dire, with Matilda and the others short of all manner of supplies. Stephen's plan to capture her was nevertheless foiled. In December, the Lady of the English and a handful of close followers escaped from Oxford Castle and avoided detection by Stephen's troops to make their way back west towards Bristol. There are differing accounts of how she made her escape. One has Matilda simply leaving through a postern or rear gate of the castle. Another tale, a more romantic though not implausible one, claimed that Matilda and her allies shimmied down a rope out of a window of the castle to safety and then made their escape dressed all in white to camouflage themselves against the snow, which had blanketed Oxfordshire that December. Whichever is true, we do know that Matilda made yet another narrow escape and continued to fight on against Stephen into the mid-1140s. While the war had taken many shifts and turns in England in 1141 and 1142, matters were more clear-cut in northern France. Here, Matilda's husband, Geoffrey of Anjou, had invaded Normandy and largely took over the duchy for her cause in the early 1140s. Normandy would remain under Angevin control for the most part for the remainder of the war, with Geoffrey, effectively, adding Normandy to the counties of Anjou, Maine and Touraine to become a French lord who could rival the King of France in terms of the size of his lands and power. By this time, the battle lines of the war had clearly emerged. France was lost to the Angevins, whereas in England, Matilda controlled the West Country, West Midlands, and part of the northwest of England, while Stephen had a solid base of support in the south, the home counties around London, north to East Anglia, and further north again towards York. The Midlands were the front lines, though the Anarchy, as the chronicles written at the time make resoundingly clear, was leading to devastation all over England as local lords and knights used the chaos and the breakdown of royal power as an opportunity to extend their own lands and benefit themselves. The mid-1140s was a period of relative inactivity in the Civil War by comparison with the dramatic events of 1141 and 1142. First, the two sides became evenly matched and consolidated their control over various parts of England. Then, events far away to the east conspired to limit the scale of the conflict. In 1144, the county of Edessa, one of the 4 major Christian Crusader states that had been established in the Levant as part of the First Crusade half a century earlier, was captured by a Syrian Muslim warlord by the name of Zengi. When word of these developments arrived in Western Europe, a new crusade was preached and gained huge support. The King of France, Louis VII, was amongst those who took the cross and headed for the Holy Land. With their liege lord having committed to the Second Crusade, many French lords, the backbone of Matilda's support in the civil war with Stephen, agreed to head east as well, though some were diverted to Iberia in the end. where Lisbon was conquered for the Christian cause in 1147. To compound matters, several of Matilda's other allies died during the mid-1140s, including Geoffrey de Mandeville, Earl of Essex, who was killed in a military clash against Stephen's forces in 1144, and her most faithful ally, her half-brother, Robert of Gloucester, who died nearing his 60th year in a relatively peaceful repose at Bristol Castle in the late autumn of 1147. All of this ensured a lull in fighting during these years. The period that followed saw a fundamental change in the nature of the war. By then, Matilda's eldest son, Henry Fitz-Empress, was entering what would be considered his teenage years today, but which in the medieval era were deemed to be the first years of adulthood. In such a situation, he was increasingly presented as the potential future king if Matilda and her allies were successful in the conflict, with the possibility even that Matilda would rule in association with her son. As early as 1147, when he was just 14, Henry crossed to England from northern France at the head of a large force of mercenaries that had been hired to compensate for the loss of many troops that had headed on crusade. A symbolic changing of the guard followed as Robert of Gloucester passed away, and then Matilda left England herself in 1148. The latter decision was partly taken owing to a clash between Matilda and the Bishop of Salisbury, Jocelyn de Beaumont, over the ownership of Devizes Castle, the stronghold in Wiltshire, from which Matilda had made her dramatic escape, disguised as a corpse back in 1141. The bishop claimed control over Devizes, even though Matilda often resided there. The dispute had escalated in the mid-1140s, with de Beaumont even involving Pope Eugene III. Deciding to cut her losses, and with her son now playing a more prominent role in affairs, Matilda headed for France. She would spend most of the remaining years of the Civil War at Rouen in Normandy. The political situation continued to shift in the period that followed. A critical moment came when Matilda's second husband, Geoffrey of Anjou, died suddenly and unexpectedly at just 38 years of age in September 1151. A chronicle written by John of Marmoutier claimed that Geoffrey had been attending a council of his nobles and advisors at Le Mans when he suddenly came down sick with a severe fever. His illness was swift, and he died on September 7th. He was buried in St. Julian's Cathedral in Le Mans, where Matilda had an effigy of him placed over his tomb. His personal coat of arms, which included a blue shield and gold lions, was displayed in one of the earliest examples of the use of a heraldic coat of arms in medieval Europe. It is significant that Matilda commissioned this, and the coat of arms in question influenced the royal coat of arms of the English monarchs in centuries to come. Geoffrey's death otherwise cemented Henry's status as the leader of the war effort on his mother's side, as he became Count of Anjou at the age of 18, and effectively Duke of Normandy as well. Already emerging as a shrewd military leader and political ruler, Henry, in conjunction with his mother, began playing a diplomatic game in the early 1150s, whereby the papacy, the King of France, and the Lords of England were all courted to support Matilda and Henry's claim to the throne, the realization being that diplomacy might gain what war had failed to acquire over the previous decade. On the opposing side, a rival was emerging to Henry. Stephen's eldest son Eustace was a few years older than Henry, and was being presented to the English political nation by Stephen as his successor. This was even more relevant on that side of the English Channel, as Stephen was upwards of a decade older than Matilda, and it was probable that he would die before his first cousin. Thus, from Normandy in the early 1150s, Matilda was conscious that the clash was now to see if Eustace or Henry would succeed Stephen. The days when she might claim the throne herself and rule in her own right, in realization of her father's wishes so many years earlier, were passing. Events culminated around the siege of Wallingford Castle in 1153, where Stephen hoped to defeat one of Matilda's major English allies, Brian Fitzcount. Henry campaigned against Stephen to prevent this. After a stalemate had been reached yet again, that summer an agreement was reached, variously known as the Treaty of Wallingford and the Treaty of Winchester. Through this, Henry agreed to end his efforts to supplant Stephen and accept him as the King of England, with the condition that when Stephen died, Henry would succeed him, not Eustace or any of Stephen's other sons. The Treaty of Wallingford had seemingly brought the anarchy to an end After 15 years of civil war and decades of tension over the succession, one wonders what Matilda's reaction was in Normandy when news of the agreement her son had reached arrived there. The settlement was perhaps not as concrete as it appears, though. In the months that followed, Stephen embarked on a flurry of activity to rouse his allies and tour England. It leaves the suspicion that he was making plans to try to renounce the agreement and commence the war again once the time was politically advantageous. However, just as the death of members of the royal family during the White Ship disaster in 1120 and of old King Henry I in 1135 had led to the Anarchy, the deaths of two royals in quick succession ended it in the mid-1150s. First, Eustace died unexpectedly in August 1153, and then Stephen died just over a year later in October 1154. With this, the Anarchy came to an end. Matilda was victorious, though the victory was largely for her son, who quickly secured control over the government of England after Stephen's death. He was crowned on December 19, 1154, as King Henry II at Westminster Abbey. Fittingly, during the ceremony, one of the crowns used was that which Matilda had brought back from her time married to Emperor Henry V in Germany 3 decades earlier, a symbolic statement of how Henry's mother had kept her line's claim to the throne alive since her days in Central Europe as a young woman. With the death of Stephen and the accession of her son as King Henry II, Matilda found herself for the first time in nearly 2 decades not fighting a war to claim her birthright and to implement the wishes of her father. She had not become queen herself, but her eldest son, who she had symbolically named after his grandfather, had. Matilda was victorious, and she now entered a period of quasi-retirement. She did not live in England, remaining instead in Normandy and spending the remainder of her life there. Although Henry was the Duke of Normandy, his mother acted as one of his senior representatives there as the new king. Unlike his great-grandfather and grandfather, William the Conqueror and Henry I, he viewed himself primarily as an English monarch rather than a French lord, who just happened to be King of England as well. During these years, there was also a symbolic effort to acknowledge Matilda's position as the daughter of King Henry III. Consequently, despite her retirement in Normandy, we have royal charters and other government documents from the second half of the 1150s and into the 1160s, which bear both Henry and Matilda's names and royal seals, a tacit acknowledgement that although Henry was the king, he had only become so through his mother stepping aside to allow him to succeed Stephen. During her later years in Normandy, Matilda became a major patron of the church and the religious orders in northern France. In particular, she was known for the favour she bestowed on the Augustinians. These were a religious order that lived monastic lives in accordance with the religious strictures of St. Augustine of Hippo, one of the great early church fathers. In 1059, agreements were reached concerning monastic life at the Lateran Synod, and this prepared the way for the emergence of the Augustinians as a religious order which challenged the supremacy of the Benedictines across Christendom in the 12th century. Matilda was a major patroness of them in northern France, both during the Anarchy and especially during her semi-retirement, when money could be diverted to the purpose and not towards raising armies. Though both the Benedictines and the Cistercians also benefited from her benevolence, she bestowed funding on the Abbey of Bec in Normandy, for instance, an institution which she had patronized for decades, and also on Bordesley Abbey in Worcestershire in England. In all instances, there was an awareness of the political benefits of patronizing religious abbeys and houses which played a prominent role in local politics, something Matilda had become aware of in her early years in Germany and had deployed as a political tool for decades. Her initial patronage of Bordesley, for instance, dated back to the early 1140s, when she cultivated relations there as a means of securing control over Worcestershire in the context of the Civil War. This political scheming aside, there is no doubt that Matilda was a genuine favourer of church reform and revitalisation, and she continued in her later years to sponsor the church in Normandy and further afield. Matilda was far from politically dormant in the years following the accession of her son as king. Though most of the letters involved are lost, it is clear from the chronicles and other ancillary evidence that Matilda maintained an extensive correspondence with her son during the second half of the 1150s and into the 1160s, with letters passing from Normandy to England and back again as she advised him on many political issues. One topic on which she tried to advise Henry concerned Thomas Becket, a leading prelate and politician who was appointed by Henry as Lord Chancellor of England shortly after his accession. In 1162, Becket was promoted to the position of Archbishop of Canterbury within the Church. This brought the formerly loyal Chancellor into conflict with Henry, as the pair clashed over the rights and privileges of the Church and the degree to which the Archbishops of Canterbury were answerable to the Pope in Rome alone, or had to also seek the permission of the kings of England before acting on various matters. The dispute would intensify throughout the 1160s. Matilda advised Henry to de-escalate the situation. He did not take her advice, and eventually, in 1170, Becket was murdered in Canterbury Cathedral, though the degree to which Henry sanctioned the assassination has been extensively debated ever since. She also advised Henry not to launch a military expedition to Ireland in the 1150s to begin conquering the neighbouring island from its many Irish lords. Perhaps she was right. Henry did eventually sanction such a campaign after his mother died, beginning centuries of English entanglement with Ireland. Matilda was into her 60s as her son's relationship with Becket began to deteriorate. She lived eventually to be 65 years old, a ripe old age for the time. Her later years saw her take a back seat in all matters political, no doubt enjoying the frequent visits of her grandchildren to Normandy, from amongst whom there would be two kings of England, King Richard I, better known as Richard the Lionheart, and King John I, two queens, Eleanor, Queen of Castile, and Joan, Queen of Sicily, and also several lords and ladies of other major polities. Her son and grandsons would rule over lands in England, France, Wales, and even Ireland, which became known as the Angevin Empire in recognition of her marriage to Geoffrey, Count of Anjou, while the Plantagenet family name, which she acquired through that same union, was held by the rulers of England down to 1485, when the House of Tudor came to power at the end of the Wars of the Roses. Matilda died at home in Rouen, in Normandy, on September 10, 1167. She was buried at the Abbey of Bec, which she had patronized for decades. Her remains, though, were moved, lost, and found again on several occasions over the centuries, only to find their way to their current resting place at Rouen Cathedral in the mid-19th century. At Bec, her tomb still bears the epitaph, "Great by birth, greater by marriage, greatest in her offspring. Here lies Matilda, the daughter, wife, and mother of Henry." Empress Matilda was one of the most unusual political figures of the High Middle Ages. During a long and varied life, she became Holy Roman Empress, was involved in the governance of parts of Germany and Italy while little more than a teenager, then became the Countess of Anjou in the late 1120s, before fighting a major civil war over a period of nearly 2 decades to claim her right to become Queen of England, in fulfillment of her late father's wishes. She proved herself a formidable adversary, managing for a time in 1141 to seemingly defeat Stephen and claim her birthright, though the rout of Winchester and the subsequent release of her first cousin snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. Admittedly, her unflinching determination to become Queen of England caused much suffering, with the country cast into disorder, economic devastation, and war, but Matilda was not alone in her desire to end Stephen's reign. In the end, her doggedness ensured that her cause survived long enough for her son to rise to the fore and resolve the fundamental issue which had caused the war to begin with, the prospect of a female monarch. In the end, Matilda was not able to fully realize her father's plans for the succession, but the accession of her son as King Henry II in 1154 was as good an alternative as could be construed out of the chaos of the Anarchy. Isabella, later known as Isabella of France or Queen Isabella of England, entered this world sometime in the mid-1290s in Paris, France, most likely in 1295 or possibly 1296. The exact date remains unclear, a not uncommon occurrence when it comes to medieval births, for which records can often be fragmentary. Her father stood as King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, on account of his alleged good looks. He had succeeded to the French throne in 1284. Philip was also King of Navarre due to his marriage to Isabella's mother, Queen Joan of Navarre, a small kingdom which lay primarily on the Spanish side of the Pyrenees in what is now the Basque country in the northeast of Spain. She and Philip had married in 1284. Isabella was their sixth child. Two daughters had been born before her, Margaret at some point in the late 1280s and Blanche in 1290. Blanche died when she was 3 years old in 1294, before Isabella came into the world, and Margaret would also die in childhood in 1300, making Isabella her father's only daughter within a few years of her birth, and hence a valuable bargaining chip when it came to the politics of Western Europe. Isabella also had 4 brothers: Louis, born in 1289, Philip, born around 1291, Charles, born in 1294, and Robert, born in 1296 or 1297, thus making Robert Isabella's only younger sibling. Robert would die too in childhood, but Louis, Philip, and Charles would each live to become kings of France and Navarre, one after another. The political circumstances of both France and England by the time of her birth in the late 13th century are critical to understanding the trajectory of Isabella's entire life. Unlike in early modern and modern times, France was not a united kingdom during either the High Middle Ages or the later medieval period. It was deeply divided, with powers such as the Dukes of Burgundy holding extensive lands in the east of the country and others such as the Counts of Flanders dominating the region around much of Belgium and northeastern France. The papacy in Rome even controlled a small fiefdom in southern France centered on the city of Avignon. The kings of France nominally claimed control over the whole country, yet their power was prone to rising and falling over the decades, with various nobles and lords exercising great amounts of independence when there were weak rulers in Paris. In contrast, King Edward I of England had created one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe since his accession in 1272, imposing English control over Wales and also waging war on Scotland to try to unify all of Britain under his rule, while he also held extensive lands in Ireland. In France, Edward held much of the southwest of the country around Bordeaux and its hinterland as Duke of Aquitaine, though this was a far cry from his predecessors in the 12th century, who at one time had held nearly half of the territory of modern-day France, with vast regions in the north and west being under English control. What this French legacy meant was that the affairs of the kings of England and France were inextricably interconnected, and this would impact Isabella's life when she was just a child. It would continue to do so down to the end of her life, and her son would attempt to impose himself as King of France from the late 1330s onwards. Unlike many of her predecessors as Queen of England in the 12th and 13th centuries, there are a large number of sources extant today for the study of Isabella's life. Many of these were chronicles written in the medieval tradition by figures like Thomas Walsingham, a late 14th century Benedictine monk who wrote an extensive history of the rulers of England from the early 14th century up to his own time. Another was Walter of Swinbroke, whose Chronicon Angliae, or English Chronicle, charted the reigns of Isabella's husband, Edward II, and her son, Edward III, in the process providing many details on Isabella herself and her role in both. A French chronicler, Guillaume de Nangis, wrote extensively on events at the end of the 13th century, in a way which pertains to Isabella's very earliest years and the circumstances that gave rise to her marriage with Edward II. Similarly, the Wigmore Chronicles, a set of annals of major events in English history between the middle of the 11th century and the start of the 14th, also casts light on the political circumstances in England when Isabella arrived there, while there was a growing amount of bureaucratic records being produced in 14th century England, due to it being the most centralized state in Western Europe at the time. Yet, these sources have their limitations. Medieval chroniclers did not write with the aim of maintaining an objective perspective as modern historians aspire to. Instead, they often wrote to persuade their readers of their own political views, and so many presented Isabella in a negative light for her actions in disobeying the normal bonds of matrimony at the time. As will become clear though, her actions were often those of a woman who had learned from a young age to survive by her wits. In a somewhat unusual development, which points to the evolution of European society on the cusp of the Renaissance, Isabella was afforded an elite education, something which was not customary for women in the 13th century for the most part, and which had only become common for royal princes in the 12th century. Many rulers, as recently as the 11th century, had been illiterate, and left the business of government largely to church figures and scribes, considering warfare their true domain. Around the Louvre Palace and the Palais de la Cité in Paris, she was surrounded by some of the leading scholars of the age at the University of Paris. At her father's court, she had access to tutors from a young age and a wide library. She grew up, as a result, to be one of the most educated royal women of the High Middle Ages. From the moment she was born, her father was doubtlessly considering who she would be married to. Incredibly, Philip had betrothed one of his daughters, Blanche, to the Infante, or Prince of Castile, the future King Ferdinand IV, when she was just an infant, the better to ally France with the powerful Spanish kingdom. When she died, he then betrothed his daughter Margaret to Ferdinand. But when Margaret too passed in 1300, he declined to arrange for his final daughter to potentially marry the Castilian prince. The reason was that Isabella, who was perhaps as young as 3 or 4 years of age at the time, had been promised to Prince Edward of England, the son and heir of King Edward I, in 1299. In 1294, Isabella's father had gone to war with England in an effort to seize the Duchy of Aquitaine from Edward the Fun while he was otherwise distracted by a war in Scotland. This unhappy conflict dragged on for several years without any conclusive results on both sides, and by 1297, both parties had decided that continuing the conflict was not worth the cost in men and money. Peace negotiations were entered into and were finally concluded in 1299, when the 60-year-old Edward I, a widower for nearly a decade, married Philip's 17-year-old sister, Marguerite, while Isabella was betrothed to Prince Edward, who, at least, was closer to her in age, having turned 15 in the spring of 1299. The match remained simply a betrothal at this early stage, Isabella being considered too young for a marriage to actually take place, even by the standards of the medieval period. Instead, the wedding would not take place for nearly a full decade longer. It was finally solemnized at the Church of Our Lady in the town of Boulogne, on the northern coast of France overlooking the English Channel, on January 25, 1308. By then, Edward was 23 years of age, while Isabella was nearing her teenage years, an age that was considered to be old enough for marriage in the 14th century. By then, Isabella was marrying a king rather than a prince. Edward I had died 6 months earlier, and her new husband had succeeded him as King Edward II. It would be a problematic union from the very beginning, as Edward was bisexual and tended to prefer the company of men, though he was not averse to women, and he sired an illegitimate son a few years before his marriage to Isabella. His preference for male company also extended to favouring certain male individuals at court, and allowing them and their families and factions to rise to positions of great power and wealth, something which would fracture the political community. In England during his 20-year reign, shaping Isabella's life as well in many ways in the process. A prevailing myth concerning Isabella is her relationship with the Scottish rebel William Wallace. At the time that Isabella was first betrothed to Prince Edward, his father, King Edward I, had been involved in a long-running war with the Scottish, led by a number of prominent nobles and knights, including William Wallace. This was all part of England's constant attempts throughout the High Middle Ages and late medieval period to impose control over all of Britain, including Scotland. Edward had famously largely conquered Scotland in the mid-1290s, dragging the Stone of Scone, the inauguration stone used by Scottish kings, back to England in 1296 as a symbol of the destruction of Scottish independence. It was a temporary development, however, and the Scots were soon at war with England again. William Wallace was captured as part of this new rebellion in Glasgow in 1305 and was executed in August of that year at Smithfield in London. Isabella was around 10 years old at this time and was still living in France. The suggestion that she ever knew or had a relationship with Wallace is a complete invention, though England's relationship with Scotland and the conflicts between the two nations would feature prominently in the politics of her time as Queen of England. Almost as soon as Isabella arrived in England, despite her young age, she would have been aware of a growing concern at court and wider afield about the influence of one Piers Gaveston over her husband. Gaveston was the son of a Gascon knight from England's territories in western France, who King Edward the Fun had assigned to his son and heir, Edward's household in the early 1300s. The relationship soon became problematic as Gaveston's influence over the younger Edward grew and rumours flew about the court. Edward I exiled peers from the court as a result in the mid-1300s, and then, after a brief rapprochement in 1306, ordered him to leave England entirely in 1307. Yet the old king's death just a few months later saw Gaveston being recalled, and the new king now promoted him to the title of Earl of Cornwall, while also granting him and friends and family members extensive lands and offices. All of this was creating immense unrest amongst the nobility of England, many of whom noted that the earldom of Cornwall had typically been reserved for a member of the royal family. This opposition included a faction led by the Earls of Warenne, Hereford, Pembroke and Lincoln, who just weeks after Isabella arrived in England urged Parliament to demand that Edward exile Gaveston yet again. The king relented, in large part, because Isabella's father sent word from France that he was unhappy with news of this court favourite, to whom Edward bestowed such favours when his energies should have been on making his new wife feel at home in a foreign land. King Philip was no doubt especially dismayed to learn that when Edward and Isabella's joint coronation took place at Westminster Abbey near London, a month to the day after their marriage in northern France, Gaveston was central to the ceremony, being decked out elaborately and leading the king and queen through the main aisle of the abbey during the procession. Something clearly had to change, and Gaveston was exiled yet again, being sent off on this occasion to act as the king's lieutenant. In the lordship of Ireland, Ireland was only a short boat ride away from Wales, and it was perhaps inevitable that Edward, who had been miserable when Gaveston left, conspired for peers to return secretly in the summer of 1309. A fresh political storm followed in the months after this as it became known that Gaveston was back in England. For her part, Isabella was by then of an age to be able to fully appreciate some of the political nuances of what was happening, and also the difficult marital situation which her husband's relationship with the upstart was creating. This included the uncomfortable scenario in which Edward, Isabella, and peers ended up heading north to oversee a military campaign against the Scots, who were making incursions into northern England under their new leader, Robert Bruce, the aspirant to the throne of Scotland. Edward's decision to give Gaveston command over much of the campaign that followed was sufficient cause for the nobles to yet again call for his exile in 1311. A final departure and return to England was the limit of their patience. When he reappeared in England in 1312, a cohort of nobles led by the Earls of Lancaster, Warwick and Pembroke orchestrated to have him detained and killed that summer. Isabella must have breathed a sigh of relief, but there would soon be a new royal favourite and new problems, while the tensions between Edward and his nobles would continue virtually unabated for the next 15 years. Eventually, as she grew older and learned to look after her own interests, Isabella would move from being a bystander in these political intrigues to a major player herself. Isabella's relief at the death of Gaveston in the summer of 1312 was added to by the birth of her and Edward's first child just a few months later. Edward of Windsor was born on November 13, 1312, at Windsor Castle, and was named after both his father and grandfather. Young Edward, like his mother, would have to grow up prematurely in his early teenage years as political events conspired around him. All of that was to come, though. In the interim, Isabella and Edward II had 3 further children, while suffering at least 1 miscarriage. Another boy, John, was born in 1316, solidifying the line of succession with 2 male heirs. 2 daughters then followed, Eleanor of Woodstock in the summer of 1318 and Joan in the summer of 1321, often referred to as Joan of the Tower, as her mother gave birth to her in the Tower of London, the city's great medieval and early modern fortress. Isabella was seemingly central to one of the more colourful episodes to occur at the French court in the early 14th century, the Tour de Nesle affair, named after a guard tower of the old city walls of Paris. Each of her brothers had married into the nobility of Burgundy in eastern France, which, as we have seen, was a powerful rival to the French crown for dominance over large parts of the country and would remain so for another century and a half. Her brother Louis, for instance, married Margaret of Burgundy, the second daughter of Robert II, Duke of Burgundy. Philip married Joan, the daughter of Count Otto IV of Burgundy. Finally, Joan's sister, Blanche of Burgundy, married Isabella's other brother, Charles. The affair has taken on a quasi-legendary aspect over the centuries. Rumour at the time had it that, on a major state visit to France in the summer of 1313, shortly after the Gaveston affair, had seemed to bring a period of temporary peace to England. Isabella had sewn some purses for each of her brothers and her sisters-in-law. Not too long afterwards, at a social gathering at court, she noticed that two knights, Sir Gautier of Ornay and Sir Philip of Ornay, were carrying the purses which she had embroidered for two of her sisters-in-law, Blanche and Margaret. Fearing that they were engaged in affairs with the two knights, Isabella relayed her concerns to her father. King Philip responded by having some of his spies monitor the two knights and his two daughters-in-law. The results of the investigations led to the conclusion that Blanche and Margaret had been engaged in infidelities, meeting the two knights at the Tour de Nesle Tower along the city walls. In the ensuing fallout, it was also concluded that while Philip's wife Joan had not been unfaithful to her husband, she had known of the affair her sister Blanche was engaged in, and was complicit in a sense as a result. In the period that followed, both Blanche and Margaret were arrested and placed in prison, while Sir Gautier and Sir Philip were executed for their role in what was a serious social and political embarrassment for the French royal family. Blanche and Margaret were placed on trial and subjected to public humiliation by having their heads shaved. They were then sent to the Château Gaillard. Margaret died within a year, perhaps on the orders of her husband, who had become king after Isabella's father's death in November 1314, while Blanche remained imprisoned until her marriage was finally annulled in 1322, and her husband was free to marry again. Joan was eventually forgiven by her husband for her alleged role in covering up her sister and sister-in-law's actions. Isabella came out of the entire affair looking poorly to the French populace, who eventually felt sympathy for Margaret and Blanche's plight. The royal visit to France in the summer of 1313 was important in other ways. It was an episode which saw Isabella emerge for the first time as a significant power broker between England and France, and her entry into the world of high politics, as she became what we would now deem to be a young woman. The occasion was the triple knighting of her three brothers, who would then knight hundreds of other Frenchmen in a grand royal occasion which symbolized the arrival of a new generation of French nobles and leaders. Days of celebrations occurred in which Edward and Isabella were often central. There was a formal event as well, in which many individuals, Isabella included, took the cross, the symbol of the Crusaders, that had been worn since 1095 when the First Crusade began, though by 1313, the Crusader states in the Holy Land had all been conquered by the Islamic powers there. We get an insight into the foibles of royalty here, as one chronicler noted with some amusement that Edward and Isabella overslept for the ceremony of the taking of the cross. More seriously, negotiations followed in the days ahead in which King Philip, Isabella's father, assured Edward that he would have support from France if he needed it against his fractious nobles back in England. Isabella had seemingly been central to the diplomacy involved. Back in England, Isabella was soon learning that the murder of Gaveston had not brought an end to the domestic turmoil of her husband's realm. In the months prior to Gaveston's fall, the faction opposed to him had come to be controlled by Thomas, 2nd Earl of Lancaster, a first cousin of Edward's, whose grandfather was King Henry III, and whose father, Edmund Crouchback, had been King Edward III's brother. Thomas also traced his ancestry on his mother's side back to the royal families of France and Navarre. This made Lancaster the most powerful noble in England, and he had been instrumental in Gaveston's downfall. After the favourite was murdered, there followed an uneasy reconciliation between him and the king, one in which it was made clear that Edward was a monarch whose power had been seriously undermined. The years that followed were consequently characterised by continuing political turmoil, compounded when the Scots won a major victory over the English at the Battle of Bannockburn in June 1314, gaining the upper hand in the Scottish War of Independence in the process. As Edward lay on the precipice of losing Scotland, which his father had largely completed the conquest of 20 years earlier, his standing in the eyes of his nobles plummeted even further. The years that followed were marked by a growing drift towards outright conflict yet again between Edward and his nobles. The instability was compounded by a major famine between 1315 and 1317, aroused by bad weather and the mass outbreak of a bovine disease which eviscerated cattle stocks across England. The crown did nothing to assuage public opinion during this time by continuing its lavish spending, Isabella included, who had developed a habit of wasting large amounts of money on overt pomp and ceremony. When she had visited France without her husband, in 1314 for instance, the expedition required 27 ships and 13 barges to transport all of her belongings and servants across the Channel. Such frivolous expense did not go unnoticed amongst her and Edward's subjects. Yet as damaging as the famine of the mid-1310s, the loss to the Scots and the crown's profligate spending were, the issue which would spark another crisis and war was the king's continuing promotion of court favourites. For a time after Gaveston was murdered, the individual involved was Roger Mortimer, but he was soon displaced in the king's affections by Hugh Despencer the Younger, the son and heir of Hugh Despencer the Elder, Baron Despencer. As Despencer rose, as a new version of Gaveston in the late 1310s, a Despencer faction emerged as well, with many individuals around him being given lands, titles, and offices by the king. The nobles were not impressed, and in May 1321, war broke out in England as a faction led by Lancaster, Humphrey de Bohun, 4th Earl of Hereford, and a former Lord Lieutenant of the English Lordship in Ireland, Roger Mortimer, emerged to challenge Edward and the Despensers. The Despencer War, as it is often termed, lasted for 10 months between May 1321 and March 1322. In its early stages, the alliance of anti-Despencer nobles had the better of it and converged on London. It was this military action which forced Isabella to take refuge in the Tower of London and so gave birth to her daughter, Joan, there. It was just weeks later that Isabella intervened with Edward, apparently going down on her knees before her husband and imploring him to expel Despencer from England in order to bring peace back to the country. Incredibly, Edward agreed to her request and commanded Hugh and his father to leave the country. However, Isabella was also central within weeks to the renewed outbreak of hostilities when, on a pilgrimage to Canterbury, she was refused entry to and hospitality at Leeds Castle in Kent, an abode of Bartholomew de Badlesmere, a lord who had sided with Lancaster and the others against Edward just months earlier. The king took this rebuff of his wife as the excuse he needed to recommence the war, and within weeks, the Despensers were back in England with fresh reinforcements. By the spring, it was all over, with Edward and the Despensers having won victory over Lancaster, Hereford, Mortimer, and their allies at the Battle of Boroughbridge on March 16th, 1322. Whether Isabella was an oblivious pawn in Edward's machinations, and he simply used the event at Leeds Castle as an excuse to resume hostilities, or whether her entire pilgrimage to Canterbury was a clever ploy which Isabella had been complicit in, remains a mystery to this day. Victory in the Despencer War saw Edward exact revenge for a decade of wrongs which he believed had been committed by his nobles. Hereford was killed in the fighting at Boroughbridge, seemingly dying in a particularly gruesome manner, as a pike was run through his anus and into his intestines. His screams apparently dismayed his soldiers and contributed to the defeat. Lancaster was placed on trial where a panel led by the Despensers refused to let him speak in his own defence and found him guilty. He was executed 6 days after Boroughbridge, while Mortimer was detained and sentenced to death. However, he would have his sentence commuted to life imprisonment in the Tower of London, in what was a significant development for Isabella's future affairs. He escaped from the Tower in August 1323, and after a brief effort to raise a fresh revolt against the crown, fled to France. In the interim, the Despensers and their faction now had free rein to rule England as they wished. For his part, Edward began inflicting punishment on anyone who he perceived to have been responsible for Gaveston's murder back in 1312, and the undermining of his royal authority ever since. Dozens of lords and members of their families were placed in prison. Others were even less fortunate. Bartholomew de Badlesmere, the owner of Leeds Castle, where Isabella was refused hospitality in the late autumn of 1321, had reignited the Despencer War. He was dragged by a horse through the streets of Canterbury, before being hanged and decapitated outside the town, his head placed on a pike, overlooking anyone who entered or left the Kentish religious centre as a symbol of Edward's newfound power and tyranny. If Edward believed in the mid-1320s, in the aftermath of the Despencer War, that he was finally free from opposition and could rule much as he pleased, he would soon find out that he was wrong. And with Lancaster, Hereford, and many of his other opponents dead, the opposition would now come from a different, unexpected source: his wife. There were multiple reasons for her growing alienation. In late 1322, she was placed in danger while in northern England when her husband failed to respond quickly enough to a Scottish incursion into the north of the country. More worryingly, in January 1322, Isabella's brother Charles had ascended to the throne of France as King Charles IV. Over the next year or so, relations between England and France deteriorated over a number of issues, of which Edward's position as Duke of Aquitaine in western France was central. As this occurred, the Despensers began targeting Isabella herself and her large number of French staff, many of whom had lived with her in England since her arrival in 1308. In all, 27 of her household staff were removed and arrested on the grounds of being French, as well as her chaplain and personal physician. The Queen was also stripped of most of her personal lands, and her household budget was drastically reduced. The final straw was when the Despensers removed her 3 younger children, John, Eleanor and Joan, from her custody and entrusted their upbringing to Hugh Despenser's wife and sister. All of these attacks on her would combine to lead Isabella to begin plotting her own assault on the Despensers and her husband from the mid-1320s onwards. The opportunity she had been looking for came when she was sent as an envoy to France in March 1325. Isabella was dispatched across the Channel with a large retinue of staff who were loyal to Edward and the Despensers, her instructions being to negotiate peace terms in the war which had erupted between England and France, and then to return so that Edward could finally settle the war with the Scots without fear of French intervention. She was determined to act differently. Over a period of several months of negotiation in France, she moved the debate to concentrate on whether or not her husband, as Duke of Aquitaine, would come to France to pay homage to her brother, who, as King of France, was theoretically Edward's liege lord. Edward was unwilling to do this, but in response, Isabella proposed an alternative solution in the early autumn of 1325. If her 12-year-old son, Prince Edward, was sent to France, Charles would accept him paying homage as the basis for peace without his father, King Edward II, having to do so. Such a neat solution was quickly accepted, and Prince Edward, who was conveniently in southern England at the time, was conveyed across the Channel to his mother. King Edward and the Despensers had fallen for the trap. With Prince Edward, the eldest son and heir to the Kingdom of England, now in Isabella's custody in the safety of her brother's French dominions, she was in a position to launch her own campaign against her husband and the Despensers. Isabella's actions in the autumn of 1325 were compounded in the months that followed by her developing liaison with Roger Mortimer, one of the leaders of the opposition to the crown during the Despenser War, who had subsequently been imprisoned and then escaped from the Tower of London. There is no evidence to indicate, as some historians of the 19th century attempted to argue, that Isabella helped Mortimer escape from the Tower back in 1323 before he fled to France. On the other hand, there is no doubt that in France in late 1325, she began meeting with Mortimer, who had become the de facto head of an anti-crown and anti-Despenser party of English exiles in Paris. The relationship became sexual towards the end of 1325. Isabella must have been aware of how risky all of her behavior now was. After all, 2 of her sisters-in-law had been placed on trial and imprisoned over a decade earlier during the Tour de Nesle affair, owing to their infidelities. The affair she now began with Mortimer was to be one of the most colourful in the history of medieval Europe, one which burned brightly for half a decade and impacted hugely on England's politics, while also transgressing deeply held ideas of the time concerning matrimony and patriarchy. A more colourful description might suggest they were somewhat like a medieval royal Bonnie and Clyde. By early 1326, with Prince Edward in their custody and a growing amount of financial and military support being provided by Isabella's brother, King Charles IV, Isabella and Mortimer were ready to make their move against her erstwhile husband and the Despensers. On September 22, 1326, with a small flotilla of ships and men, she set sail for England. Ships mainly provided by Count Guillaume of Hainaut, whose daughter, Philippa Isabella, had promised her son Prince Edward would marry. in return for his support. They landed on the coast of Suffolk in East Anglia 2 days later. In the days that followed, the unpopular and tyrannical regime of Edward and the Despensers collapsed as leading nobles and lords abandoned the crown and sided with the small army of invaders from France, led by Isabella and Mortimer. Calls for troops to muster in defence of the government were ignored, while towns and cities such as Cambridge opened their gates to the small army from France. By early October, as Isabella and Mortimer moved towards London, Edward fled from the capital towards the West Midlands and then into Wales. On November 16th, the invasion culminated in its great success when Edward and Despenser were captured in southern Wales. Edward's fate would wait for later, but 8 days later, Despenser was found guilty in a perfunctory trial, following which he was hung from the city walls of Hereford, before being disemboweled and castrated while still alive, the ordeal of being hanged, drawn, and quartered only, coming to an end when the executioner beheaded him. Despenser was dead, and Isabella and Mortimer were in charge of England. But there was still the somewhat tricky matter of the king, who was still alive and also married to Isabella. Initially, he was placed into the custody of Henry of Lancaster at Monmouth Castle. In the weeks thereafter, Isabella's advisers devised an ingenious way of dispensing with him. Edward had briefly taken ship in the Irish Sea in the desperate days before he was captured. He had been forced to land in Wales, but the incident was now used to deploy an argument that in abandoning his kingdom, Edward had abdicated his crown. The logic followed that when he did so, Isabella and his eldest child, Prince Edward, succeeded him as King Edward III. Thus, the 14-year-old Edward was installed as king in January 1327, though with Isabella and Mortimer now heading up a regency government on his behalf during his minority. They would be the real power behind the throne for years to come. The deposed king was moved to Berkeley Castle in the spring of 1327. He was apparently well treated there in his imprisonment for the next several months. That is, until September 21st, when he was almost certainly discreetly murdered on Mortimer and Isabella's orders. Isabella and Mortimer were received in England when they arrived from France in the autumn of 1326 as saviours from the quasi-tyranny of Edward II and the Despenser faction. However, many people soon realised that they had simply swapped one form of irresponsible kleptocracy and heavy-handed rule for another. In particular, the land grab which Isabella and Mortimer engaged in during the course of 1327 and 1328 was incredible. Isabella had her dower lands, which had been stripped from her back in 1323, returned to her, but in addition, she seized huge estates which made her wealthier than any magnate had been in England for decades, with an annual rental from her lands across England and Wales that exceeded by a considerable margin those that Thomas of Lancaster, the greatest noble in the kingdom during much of Edward II's reign, had controlled. She also seized half a dozen prominent castles across England, notably Bristol Castle and Pontefract. She would go on to drain the exchequer of any remaining funds, some admittedly to pay off her soldiers, but others to finance her own largesse in the years ahead. The behaviour was echoed by Mortimer, who quickly seized vast estates across southern Wales and the English West Midlands, proclaiming himself as the Earl of March in tandem to symbolise his preponderant position in the March or border region between England and Wales. All of this very quickly saw public sentiment towards Isabella and Mortimer shift. A regency council, which included many of the leading nobles who had survived the purges of the Despenser period and the overthrow of Edward II, had been established to govern the country until such time as Edward III was of an age to rule himself. It was revealed within months, however, that Isabella and Mortimer considered this to be merely a piece of window dressing to legitimise what was effectively rule by Isabella and her lover, who could not even marry each other after Edward II was killed because Mortimer was still married to Joan de Geneville, with whom he had had a dozen children over the years. What created a scenario in which their regency became untenable were events in Scotland. In 1328, Isabella and Mortimer agreed to end the interminable war which had been underway between England and Scotland for decades by agreeing to recognise an independent Scotland with Robert Bruce as its king. To cement the alliance, Isabella offered for her youngest daughter, Joan of the Tower, to marry Bruce's son and heir, 4-year-old David, thus cementing a new rapprochement with the Scots. But while Isabella and Mortimer deemed this to be a good end to the conflict with the Scots, young King Edward III, who was now nearing his 16th birthday, considered it to be a humiliation and the abdication of much of his birthright. From this juncture, he was plotting to overthrow his mother and her lover and begin to rule in their place. The young king did not move immediately. His reticence was brought about by the failure of a rebellion in early 1329 by the 3rd Earl of Lancaster, a close cousin of the king's, and the brother of the 2nd Earl of Lancaster, who was executed at the end of the Despencer War back in 1322. Lancaster had allied with several prominent nobles to overthrow Mortimer and Isabella, yet had been outflanked by their armies when he moved on London. He surrendered and was neutralized as a threat. The entire episode served as a warning to Edward III, and his household was filled with staff loyal to his mother and Mortimer. What finally brought matters to a head was the execution in March 1330 of the Earl of Kent, a younger son of King Edward I and Edward III's half-uncle. The political realm was shocked by this transgression, and Lancaster now implored Edward to act, which he did. In mid-October 1330, he and his conspirators surrounded Isabella and Mortimer with their retinue. At Nottingham Castle, both were detained, and Edward finally affirmed his decision to begin ruling in his own stead on the cusp of his 18th birthday. 6 weeks later, Mortimer was executed at Tyburn in London. Isabella had pleaded for his life to be spared, but her son refused to listen. Isabella was placed under house arrest following the fall of her and Mortimer from power and her lover's execution. Her detention was at Berkhamsted Castle in Hertfordshire to begin with for several weeks, before she was moved to Windsor Castle shortly before Christmas 1330. This was evidently a relaxing of her conditions, as she was placed closer to where her son would have contact with her. During these months, there were clearly conversations had with her about how she could be reconciled to the new situation and rehabilitated. The story, which would be presented going forward, was that Isabella had been led astray by the malevolent Mortimer and, as a result, had temporarily failed to live in a manner that upheld her responsibilities towards her son as King of England. As these negotiations were underway, she was also mourning Mortimer, and such was her emotional state that more than one historian has concluded that she suffered a nervous breakdown of some kind during these months. Eventually, she recovered, and ever a realist and pragmatist when it came to politics, she agreed to the new narrative that had been decided upon. Since she had arrived in England 22 years earlier as a child to marry Edward II, she had learned to survive on her wits, and the circumstances she found herself in now in the early 1330s, still some way shy of her 40th year, were no different. Satisfied that she posed no further threat to her son's reign, the decision was taken to set her free in 1332. While Isabella was free from 1332 onwards, there was no doubt at all that her political life was at a virtual end. The vast lands that she had accumulated from late 1326 onwards were surrendered to the crown back at the end of 1330, but Edward now granted her Castle Rising in Norfolk in East Anglia, where she would live in her retirement. He was more than generous, allotting her a pension of $3,000 a year as well, a fortune in 14th century terms. Despite a belief in the past that Isabella was in semi-exile here, this was certainly not the case. She was regularly visited over the years by leading nobles calling to see the Queen Dowager and the mother of the king, while Edward III called on occasion too, during which Castle Rising was transformed into the centre of the political world in England as the royal court relocated here. Over time, she became a doting grandmother, as the marriage between her son and Philippa of Hainaut, which she had negotiated back in 1326, resulted in a large brood of children from the birth of a new Edward, the Black Prince, in 1330, with many more following over the 1330s and into the 1340s. Over time, she was also welcomed back to the royal court at Windsor or in London on occasion. In many ways, it was the attainment of much of what she had always sought: comfort and stability, the very things which her husband's tumultuous reign had deprived her of from her teenage years onwards, and which she had begun her relationship with Mortimer in pursuit of. Isabella was able to play a slight role in political affairs in her long retirement owing to events in France. Back in 1328, While she and Mortimer were effectively ruling England in the name of her son, Isabella's brother Charles died, the third and last of her brothers to die in quick succession after Louis in 1316, who seems to have succumbed to pleurisy, and Philip in 1322. Although Louis had a son, he died in infancy after spending just 5 days on the throne himself in 1316, while both Philip and Charles died without a male heir. Furthermore, the Salic law in France forbade a woman from becoming queen regnant, unlike in England. This opened up the possibility of Edward III having a legitimate claim to the French throne on account of his being the son of Isabella and the grandson of King Philip the Fair. However, at a meeting of the French nobles shortly after Charles's death, it was determined that Philip, Count of Valois, would succeed as King Philip VI and start a new royal line. This dispensation held firm for nearly a decade. However, in 1337, England and France ended up at war after Philip attempted to confiscate a chunk of England's remaining lands in western France around Gascony and the county of Ponthieu. With this, Edward went to war with the French, and not only that, but he decided to press his claim to the throne of France, which had been passed over in 1328. It was the beginning of what would be the 100 Years' War between England and France. As successive English monarchs tried to resurrect the Angevin Empire of the 12th century, when England had ruled much of France. As the woman through whom Edward based his claim to the French throne, and as one of the only senior surviving members of the royal house of Capet, Isabella suddenly had a new political significance from the late 1330s onwards. The 100 Years' War is generally divided into several distinct phases, in some of which England's fortunes were buoyant, while in others France gained the upper hand. The first phase lasted from the outbreak of the war in 1337 down to 1360 and was generally one in which England had the better of the fighting, particularly in the mid to late 1340s, when Edward led campaigns to France and won major strategic victories at the battles of Crécy in 1346 and the Battle of Calais the following year. With this, peace negotiations were commenced, in which it was assumed the French would make considerable concessions to Edward. At this juncture, there was a proposal that Isabella, with her French heritage, would possibly be sent to France to negotiate on behalf of her son, whose claim to the French throne was based on Isabella being the last surviving child of King Philip the Fair. Yet the outbreak of the Black Death, the worst first wave of the bubonic plague across Europe, scuppered the planned diplomatic mission and stalled affairs in the wider war thereafter for several years. It was not until 1356 that a major breakthrough was made again when Edward won another significant victory at the Battle of Poitiers, where King John II of France was captured. Following this, Isabella was involved in English negotiations with Charles II, King of Navarre, whose dominions lay to the south of the English possessions in Aquitaine in southwestern France, and who was a relative of Isabella's, his grandfather having been King Louis the Bex of France, Isabella's brother. Charles was aiming to claim the French throne himself after King John was captured at Poitiers, though he failed in this. And whatever Isabella's intervention with him might have achieved, it could not stop Charles constantly switching sides in the wider conflict between France and England. The diplomatic mission to Charles of Navarre was one of the last actions of Isabella's life. She appeared at Windsor Castle, which her son had expanded dramatically to make the finest royal castle in England, for the St. George's Day celebrations there on April 23, 1358, and was noted for the riches of her dress, which purportedly was inlaid with hundreds of precious gemstones such as rubies and upwards of 2,000 pearls. This ostentatious display of wealth was somewhat in contrast to her decision, just a few weeks later, to take the nun's habit of the Poor Clares or Order of St. Clare, a monastic order founded centuries earlier by St. Clare of Assisi, one of St. Francis's first followers. She had been ill for several months, and must have been aware when she made this decision that her life was coming to an end. Isabella died on August 22, 1358, most likely at 63 or so years of age. A longer than usual delay followed before her funeral was finally held on November 27, 1358. Although it had already become a tradition to bury the kings of England at Westminster Abbey by this time, this did not necessarily extend to queen consorts, and so Isabella was interred at Greyfriars Church in London alongside her aunt, Queen Marguerite, Edward III's second wife, and the same king's mother, Eleanor of Provence, wife of King Henry III. There she was laid to rest with the clothes she had worn as a child on the cusp of her teenage years, the day she married Edward II, a half a century earlier draped over her. Her daughter Joan of the Tower was buried there as well 4 years later. Many of those who might have looked at Isabella as a malevolent figure, who had extended the instability wrought by Edward II's reign beyond 1326, may have looked to the future as potentially being a more favourable time for England. And it must be said that for a time in the middle of the 14th century under her son, the kingdom's fortunes did markedly improve as England had the better of the opening stages of the 100 Years' War. But they would soon have been disabused of this notion in the period following Isabella's death. England's problem, it transpired, did not lie with the former queen, but within the wider politics of the realm. Edward's grandson, King Richard II, presided over a period from his accession in the late 1370s in which renewed unrest between England's nobles and the crown broke out. It ebbed and flowed until he was overthrown and killed by his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, Isabella's great-grandson, in 1399. And this only led to a period of vague stability until the middle of the 15th century, when a new civil war, the Wars of the Roses, erupted again. Isabella and Mortimer, it turned out, were symptoms of the political instability which constantly pitted the crown against the nobles in late medieval England, not the cause of it. Isabella of France has a reputation as one of the most formidable female figures of English history, being termed a she-wolf in 2 eminent early 21st century studies of her life. But if she became a she-wolf over time, she certainly did not arrive in England as one. Instead, she was a child being married off to an adult male in a foreign land for the sake of political expediency. Then, as she grew up, she learned that her husband was a ruler who was seemingly intent on choosing favourites at his court in ways that antagonized the majority of the political community. There was constant instability around her and war with foreign enemies. In this environment, she had to adapt and became ruthless herself in trying to promote her own interests in a situation where she knew her husband would not. It was this situation that led to her eventually beginning her relationship with Mortimer and overthrowing her own husband. She was badly regarded for centuries as a result, a development that simply points towards a latent misogyny in assessing the actions of a woman who was deemed to have broken the natural laws of matrimony. Many historians in the 19th and early 20th centuries suggested that she destabilized England as a result, but in reality, the conflicts of the 1320s were merely few amongst many that characterized the English crown's relationship with the wider political community between the 12th and 17th centuries. Ultimately, if Isabella was ruthless, it was in response to finding herself in this politically volatile environment at such a young and vulnerable age. And so we close Part 1 of our gentle journey through the lives of England's remarkable queens. These medieval powerhouses, Empress Matilda with her unwavering determination to claim her rightful throne, and Isabella of France, who transformed from an innocent child bride into the formidable she-wolf of France, showed us how women navigated the treacherous waters of medieval politics with courage, cunning, and resilience. Join us next time for Part 2, where we'll explore the Tudor matriarch, Lady Margaret Beaufort, whose devotion to her son would help establish a dynasty, and Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess whose marriage would shake the very foundations of English religion and society. Until then, sweet dreams, dear listener, and may these tales of medieval queens carry you gently into peaceful slumber.